Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's event at the East Hampton Library. And welcome to everyone who's zooming in from home today. Welcome. Today we have with us author, we have Dinitia Smith, author of The Prince. And The Prince is a modern retelling of The Golden Bowl by Henry James. And just a little bit about the author. Ms. Smith is the author of 4 previous novels, including The Illusionist, which was a New York Times notable book of the year. And her short stories have been published in numerous magazines. And for 11 years, she was a reporter at the New York Times, where she wrote on literary topics and intellectual trends. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Dinitia Smith today. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I am actually Dinitia, and I will say that my children, nobody can pronounce this name, and my children used to call me Dementia, so I forgive everyone who people often. I want to just give you a little chat about Henry James. The Golden Bowl, which was published in 1904, was his penultimate novel. It was the height of what we call James's late style, which some of you may realize or know is extremely complicated. And yes, and I have theories on why his language becomes more difficult. Scholars attribute it to the fact that he was hiring typists. He had what we call carpal tunnel syndrome, they say, which many of us who are writers have had, and it was hard for him to type. So he hired these typists, and he walked around telling them what he wanted to say, and thus he became even more discursive. I have another theory about his language, which, if there's time, I will discuss because it interests me, and it is only a theory. However, in regard to the difficulties, especially of the Golden Bowl, H.G. Wells said of Henry James was like an elephant trying to push a pea into the corner of his cage without losing his dignity. So this is what we have in front of us. Now, I love the Golden Bowl. I still don't understand it completely. I love it, and there's a reason I love it, but you certainly don't have to have read it to enjoy, if you can, my novel. The other thing is that my novel is written in contemporary, ordinary English. I wouldn't ever be able to imitate his style. But it's an interesting situation. Why was I drawn to this novel? The Prince, my novel, and his novel is about a family, a wealthy family, with a terrible secret. And the way this secret is resolved is almost Machiavellian. It's stunning. I think I'm going to leave it to you to find out if you ever read this novel, my novel, The Prince, because I stole from Henry James. I stole the outlines of his novel, which was set during the Gilded Age, and brought it up into the 21st century. But I posited the same situation that he has. So let's just talk about the robber barons, the Gilded Age, and inherited wealth, because that's a bit at the background of this novel. Henry James, many of his characters are the offspring or the immediate members of what we call the robber baron class, the people who built American industry at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. We know from history that these people were really rather brutal. They were not well educated. They built the railroads. They built the steel mills. And now their descendants into this century have inherited this wealth. They're educated people, many of them, and they're very aware of their antecedents. They know where the money came from. you'll see quite a few of those people. The Rockefellers, they often they're philanthropists. A lot of them are environmentalists. They become physicians. They do what we would call the public good. Not all, but of course they do. So in a way, their life, their beliefs, their activities are contrary to these suppositions, the behavior of their antecedents who gave them this enormous money. So my novel is centered on a family that is a descendant of these people. The patriarch of the family is a widower, Henry Woodford. He has become a public interest lawyer, and he's very aware of everything that his ancestors did, but he still lives in an atmosphere of immense wealth that he realizes fully what it enables him to do with his life. So he has a daughter who is Emily. We're talking about my novel, but it's the same outline as the prince. His daughter is a young woman, very innocent, very sweet, pretty. They're very, very close, and I will discuss her later, but she had a good education, but she was brought up in an environment where you didn't show your education, you didn't boast, She has become engaged to an impoverished Italian prince, as in the James novel. Now, you may ask, how could there be an impoverished Italian prince in the 21st century? Well, yes, there can. The reasons for this are that, of course, the Italian government doesn't recognize titles. And secondly, the taxes on these princely estates are huge. They have a kind of status, landmark status, to put it crudely. And so these descendants, those who remain, they have to support the upkeep if they want to keep these places. And they often rent out rooms, or they give tours. And of course, not every one of them still has these properties because they're very expensive to maintain. The wealth, whatever wealth there could have been, has been dispersed. So my guy, Federico, I call him, he is a good soul. He's going to marry into this family. By the way, there's an historical reality to this because, as you may be aware, during the so-called Gilded Age, the wealthy families of America, in fact, married into European royalty, the impoverished European royalty. They gained the cachet of a title, and the Europeans, gained some much-needed cash. So I found in my research, I actually found an Italian prince who was operating a pizza truck in Los Angeles. Really, true, a pizza truck. And of course, you can't even buy that title, or you could at the time I was researching, on eBay. I mean, not eBay, you could pay for it with PayPal. You could buy a title. So there you are. So this young man, Federico, is a bit of a lost soul. His mother is aging. He doesn't have the money to take care of her. They live in this big old Rome apartment with squares and rectangles on the wall where the great art that they sold off was the shadows, or the reverse shadows. And he tries to tries to start an Italian rap group. He wants to do some good, and as you well know, Rome is filled with migrants from North Africa. So he, for example, volunteers to be a soccer coach for these migrant kids. So he doesn't really know who he is. Then he gets a job in New York in an Italian bank. He knows nothing about finance, but he is brought in as a kind of decoration when they're trying to get people to invest in Italian securities. This is Prince Pavlacino. He is engaged to this very lovely young woman. The James novel takes place in the UK. My novel takes place always in New York, and on a private island, which I modeled after Gardner's Island, though the novel had absolutely nothing to do with that family, but I had visited it a couple of times as a journalist. So you will if you read the novel, recognize certain elements that are, those of you who've been on the island. So I was interested in the notion that one family could own an island, I think one of the largest private islands, if not the largest, in the Sound, and nobody can go on it. And that fascinates me. And in a way, it became a metaphor because it's a primeval place. It has a kind of innocence, but this is what, in a funny way, metaphorically, has to be overcome with this family crisis. So they're going to get married. And at the very moment that they're going to get married, just before the wedding, the prince's old girlfriend shows up. She has been a childhood friend of his future bride. And they'd had this affair, but they couldn't marry, or he wouldn't marry her because she had no money. And he feels that he needs money to help care for his mother, but that's basically what's driving him. I mean, he's, as I said, a bit of a lost soul. So now she comes on the scene back to New York. She's Italian-American, and to his surprise. So she arrives, and I will describe her. And there she was, standing before him, tall, slender, long-necked, her dark blonde hair pulled back today, her skin luminous in the heat. She wore a sleeveless blue cotton dress, loose-fitting and plain, with a low, square neck, which showed her slender arms and legs and her thin feet and long toes. Unmoving, she looked back at Federico, her head held high, amused. This was Christina, strong, defended, slightly mocking. "Federico," she said, "I didn't know you were here." Aha. It turns out she was also a girlhood friend of the future bride. So they become these two. There's enormous tension. This guy had loved this woman, Prince. He had loved this woman, and he loves his wife, which I hope creates an unbearable tension in the novel. He knows that his future wife is a good woman and a lovely woman and a kind woman, and he tries to resist this old love, but they resume this affair in secret. So the trajectory of the novel is really the growing awareness on the part of his wife, now wife, and her father, well, we'll get to that in a minute, of some things happening. Now, one of the genius things about Henry James, and I'd like to hope that I was able to mimic this, is that you never see in the James novel an accusation, "You're having an affair with her." You never see that. You never see that language. But he conveys to you this growing awareness on the part of this woman that her husband may be having an affair with her girlhood friend. So one of the things that's amazing, if you picture Emily, she is, as I said, sweet, pretty, kind. She encourages her father to marry this old girlfriend, her father, the widower, who is mourning, very lonely because his wife died. So at that point in the novel, you're not entirely sure how much she knows. She knows something. She's unhappy, but she's not fully aware of what it is. And as someone said about Henry James, for Henry James, love is not wanting to know or trying to ignore what you know. And is that a cynical view of love? So the trajectory of the novel is this growing awareness. And so the genius of the book, I think, is how he conveys, and I hope I was able to, the gradual awareness. And in bringing this book into the 21st century, I had more to work with. I changed the setting, the backgrounds of the characters. James never goes into this. He talks about, in his novel, the patriarch of the family comes from something called American City, which is, I consider, a wonderful name because it's implied he was a railroad man. Anyway, the genius of the language is this, to me, the genius of the book is this tension, which gradually seems to grow. And to me, the brilliance, what drew me to James and to write about this is this, what I consider the absolutely stunning resolution this family has to this dreadful, dreadful problem. Because all through this affair, they're still a family. They celebrate holidays together. There's a child. The prince has a baby with his wife. So there are these family gatherings, and there's both characters, the bad woman, or Christina, she's not bad, but and the prince are profoundly guilty about what they're doing. They're completely cognizant. She married this older man, the patriarch. He's also a good man, and she knows that he's good. So I tried in the novel, my novel, The Prince, to set this up, to make this happen, this enormous tension. And so as I said, the resolution, it's been called monstrous. It's been called, critics have called it Machiavellian, but I will tell you it doesn't involve a murder at all. So that is kind of what the novel's about. And I wish you would all ask me questions about how it all came to be, or whatever you want about my work. And I'd be very happy to answer those questions if you have some. Okay. Yes.
This is just going on and going nowhere. So I'm assuming that because you're a modern author and you're not Henry James, and we're not in that period where we can sit for hours and read a book, that the pacing of your novel is different than Henry James. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm very conscious of that issue. It actually wasn't hard for me. It was very important that the way I structured the novel made you want to turn the page. And I'm looking to see how long my novel is. It's by no means as long as Henry James's. It's probably about, let's see, roughly close to 300, not that long. So to me, it's a craft issue in all the novels. All I ever want to do is tell a story. That's what I like. And I now had to figure out how to tell you that story and make you want to hear the end. I wanted you to, and it is a craft issue. You should remember, I don't recall if this novel was serialized, but a lot of those novels were serialized. And that provided sometimes a logical ending to each episode, which would make the reader want to go. Dickens did that. So yes, I hope it was just a conscious craft intention on my end. So, yeah. Yes.
New book. Why did you choose to take a book that was already written, known, revered, and write an update, basically an update with a new twist here and there?
Yes.
This is very interesting
Why,
to me.
thank you. Because I just wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal on novels taken from the classics, modern novels, contemporary novels. And one of the things that I came across, well, I want to give you an idea. Willa Cather, Mark Twain, many people have said there are no new stories in life. There are these themes, the fall of the great man, Shakespeare, because of his own weaknesses or his character flaws. There's the forbidden love story. Okay, so given that, I wrote this essay on many, many novels taken from the classics. One interesting example would be a recent novel by one of my favorite writers, Pat Barker, The Silence of the Girls, in which she took the Iliad and talked about the women of the Iliad. and she imagined what they were going through. In the Iliad, women are usually, not always, I mean, if they're Circe, they're not this, but a lot of the women are just gorgeous stick figures. And there isn't much volition. Penelope has volition. She turns the suitors down. But they don't have fully realized characters. And so Pat Barker took this, and she showed you what Briseis, if you recall in the Iliad, Briseis is a war prize given to Agamemnon, back and forth between Agamemnon and Achilles, who are fighting. It's the plot of the Iliad, as you know, is sort of complicated, but she's a war prize. She's taken from her husband and given, or taken from Troy and given to these guys. And so Pat Barker wanted to know, what is she thinking? And she gives the characters rather modern language. In one sentence, there is something like, Briseis says, so what did I do when I was captured and given to Achilles at first? I spread my legs. Now, this is very contemporary, this wording. And actually, Pat Barker, I consider one of my favorite novelists, but I didn't think that worked. I felt the contemporary sort of slang-like expression of submission to a man was not, it just jarred me. Nonetheless, it's a very interesting novel, because when you think about what these women saw, their children smashed against the wall, their husbands, murdered in the most vicious way. There's no way not to murder someone in a vicious way, but blood, guts, and now she's got to go and sleep with these people, and then sleep with another another man when she's given over in another fight between the two Greek warriors. So that's an example, but there are others that you maybe, well, look at King Lear. This is very interesting. King Lear was taken from, Shakespeare got the fable from something called the Holinshed's Chronicles. But before that, there was another, several hundred years before, another chronicle about an English king who is usually rendered in English as Lear, L-E-I-R, who had daughters and an inheritance fight over his kingdom. So that is the prime. And then you have again in the 20th century, you have Jane Smiley's novel, 1,000 Acres, which takes that story, brings it into a farm, a big farm in Iowa, and then a dispute in the inheritance. And in that novel, Larry, L-A-R-Y, Larry goes off furious, storming into the night. She takes Lear and makes it a 20th century story. And my favorite example, which I didn't put in the Wall Street Journal piece, is the series Succession, which maybe you've seen. Have you seen it? I highly recommend it. The point is, it's about a sort of Murdoch-like character with whose children are fighting over the empire, basically. And the marvelous part of this, which nobody has actually talked about, is that he calls the character, Roy is his last name, R-O-Y. His first name is, and this is a terrible thing. I love this, and I can't remember his first name, but it begins with an L. So this is the same King Lear story, only it's told from the point of view of the Murdoch Empire. And then there are other novels that I love. There's a novel in verse, which is by this great poet, Anne Carson, which takes the 10th Labor of Hercules, translates it into a story in the modern world. I don't know if you recall the 10th Labor of Hercules, but in that fable, one version has Hercules is commanded to go and destroy the cattle of this winged monster Geryon, right? And in doing that, he kills Geryon, and the cattle. He's also a red monster. The point being that this poet takes this myth and upends it. She makes Geryon, the monster, a gay boy who falls in love with Hercules, who is a handsome young man, and Hercules breaks his heart. Why she did this, I can't tell you, but she actually makes the gay youth have wings. Wings. You believe it. What can I tell you? You believe it. It's very moving. The boy is bullied in school. He's, he's brokenhearted, and she has the mother sending him off to school, smoothing his wings. It's very. I can't tell you. It works. It's one of my favorite. So there's the Wild Sargasso Sea, which is, you perhaps read Jean Rhys. That is a prequel to Jane Eyre, an examination of the sexuality of the mad woman in the attic. You recall in Jane Eyre that Rochester has a wife up there, and the implication is that he became sexually enthralled to her because she's part black. But this is an exploration of this Rhys's very well-known novel. So there's, what you're asking is, you could say there are no new stories. You could. And I guess I wanted to spend time with James. I spent a year rereading the novel, still not understanding it completely. And I have a kind of comfort with James that I will explain. His people are moving across these great estates. They're very polite, they're very genteel, they never say what they feel. However, underneath this veil of propriety, there is incredible cruelty, incredible betrayal, and great passions. So I was always interested in that. And in some way, it made these passions far more powerful. Yeah, so there you are. Does that sort of answer? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Oh, thank you. You're very sweet. I appreciate that. I don't think it's true, but it is generally true of writers. T.S. Eliot called it the mythic method. He, of course, incorporated so much into his poetry. And so I think those are the reasons that there have been books written about, some people say there are 7 basic plots. I don't know, but some people say that. I don't know if it's true. Right, but it fascinates me, the way myth and even contemporary literature, not always, but seems to reduplicate that. A lot of contemporary fiction by women takes a postmodern form, and it's not as easy to connect it to the mythic structures that we have in our culture, and all cultures, really.
We have a question from the audience at home.
Yes.
Question is from Susan. Are you a writer who works every day and at a set time? For how long do you write? Thank you for your very interesting presentation. I am from the UK and have purchased your book, which I will now read. What
a nice question. Thank you for the question. I hope she can hear me. Can she hear me? I'm delighted to answer. First of all, I am embarrassed and ashamed to tell you that I am a very irregular writer. It's very hard for me to write a book, a novel. I have to begin in the morning. Sometimes, if it's going well, it's 2 to 3 hours. There are many writers who write late into the night without stopping. When I'm going, and I'm afraid to tell you that I'm not going right now, I have to do that. and I am very distracted. I very, very unsure of what I'm doing. That's the story. But for example, I can't write in the afternoon. I will tell you that I justify this by something the poet John Ashbery told me, which is, I don't know if you know his poetry, but he said he only works an hour a day. So I thought, okay, his poems are maybe 24 lines long. My novels are 300 or 400 pages. So I hope that answers the question, but I don't set a good example to other writers.
Do we have any other questions from our audience here or at home?
I enjoy, yes, please. This book was about, I would say roughly 2 years, maybe a little less. I wasn't working at the New York Times, which was very important. My children were out of the house. When I left the paper, where I had a pretty wonderful job actually, but I left because I wanted to write more novels, and since then my pace has accelerated slightly. There was something like a 20-year gap between novels when I started working there and finally got another novel out. But it's difficult. Yes. Did that answer your question? Or? Oh, that is such a funny, and that's very sweet. I think I actually take that as a compliment because it meant you wanted to read it. And yes, the other novels took years. The previous novel, which was about George Eliot, I have a knack for choosing subjects that are, let's say, not socially relevant, but what can I do? I loved her. She was my literary heroine. And that was a much more difficult book to write because she, if you recall, or you may know, she was almost the Stephen King of her day. She became very wealthy. She was a rather, they call her homely, very plain little girl, very smart, coming from a sort of not upper working class family. Not, her father both didn't encourage her, but at the same time did, which is crucial. Anyway, she grows up, she's very uncertain, she has lots of affairs, by the way. This was a biographical novel. She has affairs with various people. She falls in love with guys. They don't love her back. And again, she's homely and she's smart, very, very smart. She becomes the editor of the Westminster Review, a literary journal. She does all the work. It is owned by her. She's living in a house in the Strand. The publisher and owner is her lover. But in the house also lives her lover, his wife, and his mistress, the children's governess. So, there was an atmosphere amongst the intelligentsia in that period of sort of free love, but she, I think, was wounded. She fell in love with Herbert Spencer, the philosopher, but they didn't have a romance because I think he was a bit on the spectrum or something. But anyway, the point being that this woman was brilliant. I cannot tell you. She spoke Hebrew, French, German, Italian, just to name a few. She was on the forefront of contemporary philosophy. She published Herbert Spencer, who was very important at that time. He invented or coined a phrase, social Darwinism. And so in order to write that novel, she was also involved in the religious controversies of the time. The German rationalists were coming in, they were questioning the total veracity of the Bible. They were Christians, but they were saying you can worship God in another way. You don't have to follow the Anglican Church or the Lutheran Church or whatever. So to write that book, I had to master, to some extent, all these intellectual phenomenon. The book was about something that only takes up 1 to 2 pages in her biography. She eventually meets the love of her life, a man called George Henry Lewis, who adores her. They can't marry, but they live as man and wife against all the conventions of the 19th century. And then encourages her. She couldn't have been a writer without his love. He dies. She's devastated. She's now probably about 58. And this young man who's a friend of the family, very handsome, very wealthy, begs her to marry him. He's 20 years younger. This is at the end of the book, of her biographies. They go to Venice on their honeymoon, and they go and he jumps off the balcony of the hotel and begs the gondoliers not to rescue him into the Grand Canal. So this is, nothing really is known about this marriage. Why did this happen? What was going on? And then he's rescued, and they go back to England and live on her estate, and they lie. They don't say what really happened. They say, she says, Johnny's been ill, Johnny's getting better, and they get to the estate. They have a nice summer. They move into their new house on the Strand, which, by the way, was bought by Bloomberg now. I don't know if he still owns it, but they decorated it. You know, they move in, and she dies a few weeks later. So nobody knows, why did she take him back? What did he want from her? Why was he begging this woman, really begging her to marry him? And he didn't need her money. You know, he had handled their financial affairs. So that was the thing that drove me to that novel. The point you asked is, how long did it take? That took probably 4 years. It was very difficult, but I, again, loved spending time with her. So, yes.
Ormond.
I've heard of this,
And
yes.
It's a sequel to Portrait of a Lady.
Oh, yes.
It's a wonderful novel because Isabel, against all odds and against her own quiet nature, triumphant. She gets rid of all these terribly duplicitous,
Really?
grungy, awful men. And she, young and rich.
I love it.
It's written in a very, very close to Jane, but easier.
Well, John Banville is, I consider him an extraordinary writer. And yeah, he's just a beautiful writer. I don't know him, but I have not read that book. I've heard of Mrs. Ormond, and now I have something to read. Frankly, sometimes I read a writer like Banville, and I'm just consumed with envy and jealousy because he's just so great. And I can't write that beautiful, I think, prose. Mine is just sort of plain, you know. But anyway, thanks for bringing that up, because now I have something to read. Yes.
We have a question from the virtual audience.
Great.
Are there any favorite UK writers, such as Thomas Hardy, who was inspired by George Eliot, that have inspired you? And that's from Susan from England.
Well, you'll be surprised at my answer. My current favorite author is this woman, Pat Barker. She's known for the Regeneration trilogy about shell-shocked World War I veterans, Sassoon, the poet, but there was another career before those novels. And Pat Barker came from a poor, working class at that, north of England family, and she wrote a series of novels about the women in post-industrial UK who were, you know, after the industrialization was deindustrialization was occurring before Thatcher came in, because of the cost and foreign products that were cheaper. And then Thatcher came in and broke the miners' strike. What happened is this left millions of men, especially, out of work, and real poverty. And the women were left, or they had to feed their children. And there was an extraordinary amount of alcoholism, abuse. So her novels are about these women, and they're about, the thing that's marvelous about them is that the women find ways. They don't always win, but they find ways of surviving, and sometimes that involves sleeping with men for money. There's a new novelist that I really recommend to all of you called Douglas Stewart, who wrote something called Shuggie Bain, which deals with the same territory, about how basically impoverished, beleaguered people find minutes of joy and also of survival at the same time, without glossing over and without pretending that their lives are not incredibly difficult and painful, and they don't always win. But that would be my strongest recommendation right now to anybody who, and again, that's a very different novel from what I wrote. Is there anything else, Stephen, that?
If anyone at home has any questions, please type them in the chat. Anyone in our studio audience have any questions?
I love answering questions if you want. Okay, please. Well, this is actually, I rather like that question, because talking about myth, the patriarch has all the power in the family. He really owns the money, and he is the father. He adores his daughter. And I thought of him as a kind of Jove-like figure. He sees things, I think. He uses his power in an extraordinary way to solve these problems, and he is the one, I think, who really solves it. Here he's got his wife is sleeping with his son-in-law, his daughter's husband. Now, this is not stated, remember, that's the brilliance of this book. And he's got to solve, what's he going to do? I think he's the one who really enacts this extraordinary conclusion to the James story, which I stole. And so he's the power, and he's sort of silent. By the way, there isn't a lot of dialogue in James. In my novel, people do talk. James's novels, he was important because he's called a precursor of modernism. The novels begin to take place within the minds of the characters. There's hardly any action. They don't talk a lot. They talk in partial sentences. So there's a kind of magisterial quality to this guy. He sees it. What does he see? Maybe he sees it all. He's the one, I think, who brings about, and I just realized this as I'm standing here, he's the author of the solution. And so that's what I would think. You don't have a question for me? Nobody?
We do have one from the audience at home. We have a question being asked. Could you comment on your other books, and which of your other books is your favorite?
I've thought about that in an odd way. The one, I think the one that's my favorite is my third novel, which was, it was taken from a real life story. Perhaps you saw a movie called Boys Don't Cry, which was based on a true story of a young person, really a girl who goes into a small town and pretends to be a boy. That was the basis for a movie. I thought that was fascinating because in this town, all the teenage girls fall madly in love with him. So I wrote a novel about such a situation. I was interested at that time in gender, in performance. What makes what would make these young girls fall in love with this very beautiful young man, woman, and what would the price be for being that? This was written, I can't remember when I published that novel, maybe 95, 96. And this was well before there was any discussion of transgender rights, transgenderism. And I was interested in what constitutes femininity, masculinity, but mostly I was interested in these kids. I set the novel in a sort of forlorn post-industrial city, which is, in my head, it was a place called Hudson, New York, which was then falling into the ground, into the River Hudson. Now is very chic, but at the time I knew it, first knew it, we have a house near there, it was, these kids were wandering around, they had nothing, no prospects, no hope. The town was falling apart, and I envisioned such kids all over. There are kids all over in small towns and cities that have lost their way. There's no prospects. So I was, actually, I think that was the main impulse. That was the thing that drove me most, was I had kids of my own. You know, I was interested in what was, how were they going to make their way? So this event had left me with this event I described left me with a way of talking about this, of the drive to happiness, the wish to love and be loved. Again, not wanting to see what's right in front of your eyes, and how that could happen. And so that, I think, as I stand here, it's my favorite novel, but who knows?
We have a question. The Prince sounds as though it would make a magnificent film. Would you consider taking it to Hollywood?
I think I would find a way. So far, yeah, go ahead. No, I will. Okay, I'll answer your question. But Hollywood, you would be interested to know, if you know the world of writers, books get optioned. Movies are never made. But the George Eliot one was optioned by this marvelous actress, Jessica Chastain. Now, I'm not even sure she knows she optioned because it was her company, you know, and I can't imagine her playing George Eliot, but she still has the option. I don't know if anything will ever come of it, but regarding this, I would hope, but I haven't heard anything yet. I hope somebody finds it, because it would make a lovely film, you know, it would, yeah.
So, what have you learned about yourself by writing these novels?
Wow. You're right, there is an element of exploration in writing a novel. You're finding something out. About myself, I've learned, well, I've come to realize how much I love the language. I grew up in the UK, and I grew up in a time when the British English was very homogeneous. It's very different today. And I came to this country and sometimes didn't understand what Americans were saying. I literally didn't understand. And I sometimes have that problem actually with films. So I learned that the language is, to me, the most beautiful thing. And all languages probably are, but ours has more variety than many languages. At least it did, let's say 30, 40 years ago, because the British English is now filled with many foreign words and slangs. But as James Joyce said, in talking about the English language, he talked about the story of Lazarus, and who rises from the dead, right? And he said in French, and my French is terrible, pardon me, but it becomes jeune homme, je te dis, lève-toi. Whereas in English, it's young man, say unto thee, arise. So the idea is English has a special flexibility, a special, to me, music. I say this without being able to speak any other language, but still. So there's that, and I learned how important stories are to me. How we all, when we're children, our parents tell us stories, and how every day we tell stories. And my friend Brooke Kroger over there, we've been telling stories each other. We've exhausted each other telling stories because she loves stories too. So, you know, that's what I've learned. None of the novels are really the same in my mind. There is one thread, but no, it's not present in this novel. So I can't really say any more. I just learned how difficult it is. Or as Thomas Mann said, which is really interesting, a real writer is someone for whom writing is more difficult than it is for other people. There you are. Just what you're saying. Yes. Oh, you're talking to a typically terrorized writer. I'm very nervous. A lot of what's going on, as it should be, as in publishing, is a great interest in race and gender, and it's time to hear those voices. There's been a great untapped literature, stories that we want to hear, need to hear, and are exciting to all of us. On the other hand, I'm not really writing about that, so I keep thinking, what interests me, I'm not sure, will interest them. And that's not a good way to go about it. You should always write for yourself, never write for anybody else as a novelist. And so I don't know what I'm going to do. I wish I did. I would be a lot happier.
Well, I thank you very much for being able to conduct this presentation today. I'd like to thank our audience in-house and our audience at home for zooming in. And if anyone would like a signed copy, we have Bookhampton, wonderful Bookhampton here, and signed copies are available for sale, and there will also be copies for sale at Bookhampton. And we'd like to thank Bookhampton for partnering with us, and we'll thank you for this wonderful presentation for the East Hampton Library.
I appreciate very much seeing you.